I have a 3 hour recording on sexuality, which goes into so many of the same themes as this Rebel Wisdom talk between Jonathan Pageau, I'm saying the name right, and oh, this is so embarrassing. I'm not going to get his name right. But it was the title was something about the new religion or something like that. And the other guy is a guy who knows a lot about religious history. I guess that's how he was introduced, and he has been making famous this new word cultocracy or cults. Man, I can't remember cult. Something about the word cult used in conjunction. Man, I can't believe this is slipping my mind so quickly. Anyway, the term is not what I. So I just wanted to say that I do think some of the political analysis of the recording is unfair between the speakers, because in some sense, like I think I mean, well, in some sense, Jonathan made room for this, but I think he could be close to finding this point. So let me just make it for him. That conspiracies actually have a vital function within societal public life, something like that, in that they are something of of a barometer, of a temperature gauge that our sense making apparatus is not is substandard, is suboptimal, and it's in some sense it's creating a sense of revulsion in the general. So it's essentially the presence of conspiracy in some sense. I mean, and this is it doesn't take a rocket science to make this equation to extract this piece of observation. Is conspiracy is the conspicuous. So essentially, because obviously when people believe in conspiracy theories, they can even be entered into and discussed nonchalantly. They can be discussed as possibilities even, and obviously there is a lot of taboo on people that propagate them or instigate them or that perhaps promote them in a very vocal or very prominent sense, because in some sense it's like a middle finger to the authority, it's a middle finger to the establishment, to the entrenched interests or whatever. And in some sense that's the public function, that they are basically saying we're not buying the narrative, we're not buying the story. And in some sense, I do think that you can just see a lot of the conspiracy theory stuff is more of a direct commentary against the inauthenticity of the fake news media. Essentially, that the quality of the decontextualization and the narrative games that are played by, let's see, by using rationality, because essentially if people just only have to make a I mean, that's what CNN has done. CNN is not objective news reporting. In some sense it is, because there's no such thing as objectivity. There's like enlightened subjectivity or something like that. You can, let's say, you can try to not you can try to have a non-partisan subjective interpolation of every matter that comes across, and you try to look at every matter with new eyes, perhaps. Like, you sort of, the easiest way that you can kind of mimic some kind of objectivity is if you kind of pretend that you have a memory problem, that you can only kind of, that you have to rebuild, reconstitute the framing of this issue from the ground up, having a kind of even sense of skepticism, an even sense of incredulity, and you look at all your sources with new afresh. You look at every source of information with a level of enlightened skepticism that you proffer across the board to all your sources evenly, that you proffer against all your sources. So you have a kind of a recapitulation of how it is that you process and constitute commentary and review and judgment on a matter or something like that. Okay, so you have that kind of process perhaps, and that's the closest you can get to, let's say, creating a procedural replica of something that you might call objective. It's objective in the sense that it's not beholden to its own preoccupation of partisan investment or entrenchment or something like that. Now, it's very clear that CNN and MSNBC, in some sense, Fox News is immune to this, because Fox News is much more authentic than this, because in some sense, each presenter gives their own account of their own meritorious subjectivity. They contextualize their subjectivity. They are personable presenters on Fox News. And they have people for every taste. They have people for every kind of audience, perhaps, because not everyone likes everybody else's personality. You know, we are a diverse population, psychologically speaking. And so a lot of people like things pitched to them at different levels, and they like levels of analysis at different levels, and they have different forms of filtration and screening. And so much as that there is a kind of lively in-house dialogos, perhaps, that is how you kind of create, let's say, a respectable consensus building of a narrative, perhaps. Anyway, I'm just trying to say that the model of Fox News is much more enlightened and much more capable of being objective, because it wears its subjectivity on its sleeve, and in some sense, they're doing it in an above board manner, in mostly speaking. And when they're not doing it in an above board manner, it's perhaps conspicuous and also capable of conspiracy attachment to it. And that is largely the ill of our times, in some sense, that um, it's not just that the reliance on conspiracy theory is a revulsion to the palpably manufactured narrative that is being fed to the public, but it is also um, that as this, in the context of having a palpably manufactured narrative and, let's say, an inauthentic sense making societal public organ of sense making, you also have a very toxic form of politics, which is, roughly speaking, on the left side of politics, out in the open. You could say that the establishment Republicans are just as evil, maybe. I'm slightly being conjecturous. I mean, I don't know, but people. I think people are probably, you know, politics has money in it, and money is the money power means that people can use expertise and false authority to disguise their partisan influence peddling and such. And I'm sure that when you have a big state, when you have a big government, then you have strings of power that are worthy of trying to be captured and pulled. And so, in some sense, this is the modern political proclivity towards being captured and corrupt. When you have a system that is viably um, cajoled by the context that money can craft. Um, I mean, again, I think that what is almost palpably, what should have been, when you talk about politics today, I think it's almost irresponsible not to talk about the interference in the election by the conspicuous actors that interfered in the election, by big tech censorship, by Jack Dorsey's Twitter, and by Facebook censoring the Hunter Biden story for no other reason than to interfere in the election results. Never mind, I mean, that was surely much more conspicuous and much more overt and nefarious than any kind of supposed secret foreign plot. Anyway, that kind of election tampering is hideous, and in some sense, I think is almost the. I mean, that's I would even say, objectively speaking, that is grounds for essentially having a kind of constitutional crisis, which you were kind of having anyway, because of. I'm not going to repeat the arguments that I make in my 3-hour sexuality and recording. I'll just point you towards that, because I go into the depravity and the problem in the American legal system, which I've been talking about quite profusely recently in my recordings. But anyway, let me just move on to say that in this sense, conspiracy theories are just like they're like a smoke alarm. They're like saying, we're not buying it. There's something fishy going on here. And this is how we essentially are making room for new sense makers in our midst. This is how we are creating a gauntlet to be discovered and to be, let's say, you can kind of mythologically kind of transpose this into essentially this is the process of kicking out the old and ushering in the new sense making, but it also creates also enough chaos perhaps as well that more nefarious things can also happen. So like in times of change there is both risk and reward, as it were, but these are somewhat almost natural processes and culture that in some sense I think are much more correctly attributed not to the gullibility of the people, but in some sense to the incredulity of the people and revulsion of the mainstream media, um, which in some sense you could say is not even the mainstream media's fault, that the culture itself is so broken, that intellectualism is so broken, which does have those historical threads in rationality, in the death of God and such and such. Um, and Jonathan said in a stark way during this exchange that we do need to worry about. Some people need a narrative. Some people do in fact need a narrative, and I would say that in some sense we had a perfectly fit narrative in the 90s: non-racialism, non-sexism. But then the social justice warriors destroyed that, and they basically turned proto-fascist. Or the identity politics people are, I think, fundamentally proto-fascist. And again, I'll just reference that I go into this in great depth in my 3 hour recording, so I'm not going to repeat that section there, because I do think that a lot of this does in fact smell of proto-fascism, which is how I kind of, and I also talk about it. I know in some sense the other speaker was saying that New Ageism, that some people, he thinks, in his opinion, I think he opines that other people incorrectly say that New Ageism is all fascism. I mean, I don't know exactly what the difference between the occultism, or what did you say, the occult culture, I can't remember the phrase that he, or the term that he made up, or that he used, it was an interesting term, and the term of New Ageism. Yes, I mean, I guess it depends how you define those sorts of things, but I do think that the people who, there's a difference between people that want to create their own enclave, their own enclave of subcultural intellectual extravagance and self-indulgence. I think that's perfectly acceptable within classical liberal philosophy, to each his own. But there's a difference when that kind of when that almost becomes a conspiracy theory, where a group of people then decide that they want to take everything over, and they don't do it in a forthright manner. They don't do it in like, this is what we say, what we mean, and this is why we want what we say, and this is how we're going to go about it. If you don't give that kind of full reading of what it is, of what your intentions are, then I think that, and you are perhaps performing some kind of societal psyop in the nefarious unfolding of your machinations. I mean, I know that just sounds like I've just described a conspiracy, but in some sense, that's what identity politics is in some sense like, because it's like they have an articulation of the problem. They don't have an articulation of the solution, but they're marching towards the future just the same. And they're kind of, and anyone who gets in their way, they will just kind of throw onto the bonfire. But maybe I'm jumping around a bit too much. Let me just think if there was anything else in this discussion that I wanted to talk about. In my 3 hour thing, I talk a lot about psychology, or at least my model of psychology, and I talk about what I call the gateway and filter between the subconscious and the unconscious, the subconscious gateway filter, and then the other unconscious gateway filter that leads to the ego on the other side. That these two things, which I somewhat jokingly label as the narcissistic gateway is the one between the subconscious and the unconscious. And everyone must have a subconscious narcissistic gateway between the subconscious and the unconscious. But there is such a way as doing it properly, as having, let's say, a benign narcissism. And that will also can only be judged in a context or in a framework of faith. And I go into this at great depth and length. And on the other side, the other gateway between the unconscious and the ego, that I call the borderline gateway. And in some sense, you have to kind of be finished with the narcissistic gateway and put it aside in order to properly develop your unconscious and your ego simultaneously. And then you have to overcome your own, let's say, borderline tendency, which, and this is dangerous because some people that are more advanced that are doing that, by the way, there's also a kind of a fourth confection, which is, so the one gateway, the narcissistic gateway, between the unconscious and the subconscious, I call that Keegan stage 2.5 as a kind of joke, because, and then the other gateway I call Keegan stage 3.5, which is the gateway between the unconscious and the ego. Keegan, I believe, although I haven't read his book, but I've been told secondhand that he talks a lot about Keegan stage 4.5, which is what he describes as a kind of apathy, a kind of nihilism, perhaps even, that people kind of get stuck in their ego. I actually believe Keegan stage 4.5 is almost a Keegan stage 3.5 and a Keegan stage 2.5 in conjunction, stabilizing a pseudo stage 4.5. But in some sense, you're not in stage 4.5. You're actually stuck between 2.5 and 3.5, and these two gateways are kind of reflecting each other. It's like two mirrors parallel to one another, and it creates like an infinity tunnel, and you think that you've created an opening into a kind of a transcendental ego. So you look into these two mirrors, and they're reflecting each other, and you think you've created infinite space, and you think you're in Keegan stage 4. You're not. You're not. You are just a toxic fascist in some sense, and you've either got a kind of scientific metaphysics, you've got a kind of materialism, you've got a pantheism, you've got a solipsism, you've got a perennialism of some kind, and the perennialism will be cashed out in some kind of narrative which excuses and justifies this particular ideology hybrid of this 2.5, 3.5. And in some sense, it's a kind of toxic, hermetical, alchemical section. A lot of this spirituality, gender is a pretty useful metaphor, and this is also why people have the kind of sexual attraction that they have with one another, because one of them is like the little and one of them is like the bigger one, and in some sense they can also play this weird kind of disgusting role reversal as well. But one of them will kind of be more borderline than the other one, and one of them will be more narcissistic than the other one. And it's almost like it's a disgusting sort of ideological rivalry in some sense, but together they can kind of see the outline of the Keegan stage 4.5, but in some sense the one who's more borderline than narcissistic gets to control the other one through the 4.5 amalgamation between the two of them. Now, this used to go on in male and female sexual heterosexuality. I wouldn't personally, I wouldn't describe it as heterosexuality. I would metaphorically describe it as a kind of spiritual lesbianism, because they're only interested in each other for the hollowness of the soul and the utility of each other's souls to amalgamate this disgusting confection. But I would say that the cultural history of what's gone on is that feminists dehumanized male sexuality, boys and men. They basically villainized male sexual preferences, male sexual choices, decision making, and out of that, they created the politics of the personal, as they call it. They created this hideous fascistic, proto-fascistic moral amoralism, compartmentalized morality, in which they could project whatever the hell they wanted onto men. So that then men take on the pseudo-intellectual narcissistic role of just being these ultra-rational belief zealots, where they can just have a nice set of beliefs and look pretty with their set of beliefs. Look at me, I've got my nice self-consistent set of beliefs. And if anyone tries to mess with my ducks that are lined up in a row, I will rabidly attack them, because that's my job. That, as a man, I have my set beliefs, and if anyone questions them, I'll threaten them, and I'll be the muscle behind the queen bee. And then the feminist says, well, I have all of these dreams and desserts and roles that have been deprived from me because they've been stolen from my identity, and I'm not envious of other people. I'm actually rightfully, self-righteously jealous of what has been stolen from my identity because of the unjust history, because of the injustices that I have inherited in this corrupt and oppressive system. And so together these two people can kind of double down in their toxicity, and in some sense they even want to maybe graduate from the sexual politics and just kind of dump it all into a new narrative that it's not even masculinity, it's capitalism, it's liberal philosophy, it's libertarian. Let's dump libertarian classical British political consciousness, and instead let's see ourselves as a liberation narrative ideology. That our narrative is one of liberation. It promises liberation. And together they have kind of, and in some sense the borderlines know that this is all bullshit. I mean, they know that it doesn't even make sense, but they never were the ones rationalizing it. That was for the pseudo-intellectuals that kind of eat the scraps on some level, that are trying to virtue signal by how well that they can fit into this matriarchy, which is, I think, in some sense a better description of the fatherland, if you ask me. People forget that the cultural revolution that was on the basis upon which the Nazis took over was completely maintained and extended from the female cultural power. I mean, it was the female Nazis that kept it functioning, that actually whipped the men into, well, it's hard to call them men. I mean, because this kind of pathetic pseudo-intellectual narcissism, this hybridized narrative, it's you end up sort of collectivizing men into this weird kind of stereotype, into this weird kind of, that everything is just a reflection of, it really does depersonalize masculinity into this weird kind of cookie cutter, generic, um, male energy itself just becomes a kind of, it gets taken for granted. Like somehow the mythology, how well men can kind of conform to the mythology and the narrative is something like that's what it means to be a good man, is just to kind of be a good hollow vessel. Um, it's a very soul obsessed ideology and narrative, and it has no understanding of the spirit. I mean, so I would generalize fascism as sort of spiritual lesbianism, but that's to understand that the spirit is the discerning, the actual critical, independent, individual ascertainment and appraisal of things. That the spirit is masculine and the soul is feminine. And the soul does not actually belong. I mean, in some sense, the soul does belong to the spirit, but at some point, the hierarchy of the spirit is that the soul belongs to God and God alone. And you can't see things through a God's eye perspective. You can only be, at best, the only begotten Son, and you can share that quality of being the only begotten Son, which is a condition of the mind, with others. So you can have the same faith, the same understanding, the same quality of discerning, but not the same instance. And I need to find what the adjective form of percipient is, but you are a percipient in the condition of the only begotten Son, which is in some sense a spiritual culture that's capable of being shared. And so the bride of Christ, I mean, I'm talking now very esoterically, but the bride of Christ is really the spirit of man. But anyway, which in some sense it's not the soul. The bride of Christ is not the soul. The bride of Christ is the spirit of man, which is in some sense the hollowness of spiritual truth and spiritual discerning and a living spirit. Because the spirit of man is a dead spirit, is a spirit of what man is essentially the capacity to hold a spirit, the capacity. So the spirit of something that can hold a spirit is the spirit of a vessel. It's like a double negative. The spirit of something that holds a spirit. Anyway, so this is somewhat a way of describing the perhaps a bit too esoteric to, that in some sense now I'm just talking directly to Jonathan, but let me see if I can ground this. That this whole diatribe is going into talking about the soul and the spirit, just to describe essentially the vacuousness of, let's say, this collective arrested development that happens when people combine, in some sense, the narcissistic gateway is more toxic than the borderline gateway, because in some sense the borderline gateway does take the hardest and longest amount of time to process, to get to grips with. Adulthood is much juvenile adolescence is much longer than early childhood. And in some sense, people still have problems because they didn't pass from the naive narcissism of the subconscious. They never found a way to fully give over from their subconscious the keys to the car, so that the unconscious and the ego could actually properly develop. And because the subconscious kind of tries to be this free rider, it's like trying to be a juvenile when your mother's in the back seat, when one of your parents is always looking over you. You can't actually properly individuate, you can't properly grow up in some sense. And the problem with growing up is that it's very messy, because you don't know what your problem is and what other people's problems are. You don't know where the boundaries are between these things. That's the borderline problem, is that it's prone to projecting narcissism onto other people. And in some sense, it's true that you should project narcissism onto other people, because that's how you can empathize with what other people are going through. But you have to understand that not all narcissism is toxic, and also that there are degrees of narcissism, and there are times and there are places and where you can try to help other people with their narcissism. In some sense, anyway, there's a separate sort of issue, but in some sense the problem is not about the narcissism, it's about the borderline. And the problem with the borderline is essentially to delineate responsibility and roles and self-actualize to some degree. And you can't self-actualize properly if you cannot say, well, I don't care what happened in the past, but here and now, this is my role, this is my job description, this is my self-actualized chosen valence of how I am presenting myself to you, and I'm renegotiating in the present now so that we have a shared understanding that's going to regulate the relations between us, or something like that, where you have some sense of semblance of directorship, of at least of co-directorship, or at least of delineated spaces, that in some spaces I'm somebody else's employee, in other spaces I'm the king of my castle, or I'm at least the king of my room, or I at least have my own space that I can. So you have spheres, you have contexts, you have delineation, and you then within that context you can plan things, you can actually manifest your own course in life in some sense with that level of sophistication and ability to kind of delineate the capacities that you can attain to, because in some small portion you have a bit of it in the complexity of your self-management, and so in some sense you are growing in self-determinism. You're growing in your ability to take responsibility. So when you are doing these sorts of things with your ego, the problem is that when other people tell you, they try to bring you back down to narcissism. They try to tell you, oh, but your beliefs are wrong, or something like that. And you're like, okay, well, maybe my beliefs are wrong, but I wasn't dealing with my beliefs right now. I'm dealing with a purpose that I need to do, and I've got a mission or something like that. And I'll when I've finished with this, then I'll meditate on my purpose later. Can you give me a small lesson plan as a suggestion, and I'll give you some feedback about how I thought about it later. So you can kind of start to mediate your own life as a kind of in a practice of a quality in which your soul is not automatically prone to other people's foisting off of, or delineating or evaluating for you or projecting onto you something. So other people can try to take you all the way down to the subconscious. Other people can also just actually within the unconscious, which is something that you almost can never stop yourself from being prone to, because you don't know what you don't know, and everything is happening in the unconscious. And so you don't know what you are doing because you don't know what you don't know. So you might be doing something that is creating waves in the ether, and you don't even know the consequences of those waves. But you're not necessarily, you can't, you, blame is a weird concept in a deep metaphysical sense, but in some sense you can't be held accountable for things that you didn't know to some degree within reason, within some reasonable common qualifications or whatever, common sense qualifications to add to that. You know, there is such a thing as a crime of omission. There is such a thing as irresponsibility, as recklessness. Um, but essentially, you know, those can be mistakes that can be forgiven. Yes, I was being reckless, but I've never had that kind of recklessness ever demonstrated to me or explained to me before. And I didn't read the warning signs because I didn't understand the warning signs, or maybe that was actually an omission on my part. I should have read the warnings before I crossed the line. But the other point is that, well, if you make a mistake, are you making the mistake because you're error prone, because you are erroneous in how you do things, or was it just an honest mistake really? Or was it nescience? So this is the big difference here in the unconscious, is to actually, you need to have some understanding of where the boundary of nescience is, and then you will have a more established way of being in Keegan stage 4 and breaking down the borderline. Generally, when people take shortcuts about nescience, and I do give some really good stuff in my 3-hour recording where I talk about uncarefulness, unseriousness, and untruthfulness, and the faux values of positivity and kindness, which, because sympathy is not a value. Sympathy is a very toxic value that disguises the 3 negative values that I mentioned right at the start of those 5 values. Anyway, that's an interesting speech. The point, though, is that it's not that it's impossible to be kind. It's not that it's impossible to be positive. But in a lot of sense, what is really holding a lot of people back in terms of developing through their borderline gateway is this kind of intellectual immaturity, and this kind of, well, I'm allowed to have my self-indulgence because otherwise I would have been destroyed by very negative people. And so they kind of harden their own hearts to developing a real wisdom, to developing a real discerning about these things, and they stunt themselves. And that's very hard because it's very hard to disentangle that. Um, well, I mean, I'm a blunt person, perhaps a person more skilled than I would be able to kind of illustrate to people, but in some sense, I feel just illustrating and demonstrating to people the proximate solution to what ails them is not good enough. The principle is more valuable in that sense. But some people don't incline themselves towards the worm of doubt. Uh, they shy away from it. They don't investigate. They're not curious. They don't care about leaving stones unturned. Now, it is true that in some sense, when you're dealing with the mysteries of life, you need to work out which one is the daddy mystery, which one is the bigger mystery, which one is the core mystery, and in some sense, in retrospect, it'll be arbitrary because you could have found the more profound, more pure truth behind another mystery, behind another door. But because in some sense, like leaving that stone unturned is also, let's say, a meta-contextual kind of thing as well, because practically speaking, anyway, so I'm just trying to talk about the simultaneous mystery of life, which is kind of like a paradox, but within that is a meta mystery that can be solved. Um, and I think something like the simultaneous mystery of life is the resolution between via negativa and via positiva, because in some sense it's all via negativa is the only path, I believe, in the understanding. But there's a way in which you kind of do get at a via positiva, but you only get it in a very virtual sense, and then in some sense what's stronger is the middle ground between the two. There's a kind of synthesis there, and it's a kind of tentative synthesis, and that is how the transcendental belief structure overcomes its own contextual depravity, because this is why the subconscious is so narcissistic and toxic, is because all beliefs are never good enough. They are always broken by a context. They will always be proven wrong in a particular context. So, and having a set of beliefs is even more poisonous and is even worse. That doesn't even help you at all. Sets of beliefs are like pits of snakes. You've just multiplied the problem now. You haven't actually responsibly fixed it. The subconscious is fundamentally poisonous. If you want to understand about my developmental structure of how to self-actualize, I would say look at one of my esoteric psychology videos that talk about the crucifixion. The latest one goes into this quite heavily, but anyway. Um, yeah, so I've kind of already kind of proffered or pointed or gestured at 9 hours of recording, so perhaps I should stop talking. But what am I saying here? So why did I go into that? I talked about beliefs because I was talking about because I was kind of giving a bit of my religious metaphysics and morality or something like that, and I was doing that because I was talking about Jonathan Pageau commenting about how people need narratives. Yeah, and in some sense, children need narratives. Children need a dream to live in, and I do think that it is necessary that we create a world that children can still understand and grow into. And in some sense, if we are going to heal the wounds between the sexual politics, we're going to have to kind of understand how both sexes traditionally played their part in a very kind of particular form of societal reproduction that we can start doing this much more consciously, much more responsibly, and in a much more sort of sustainable way that's justifiable, and that we can have the hard and soft cultural structures that we need in order to have also a system that has more justice in it. I really do want a lot of legal reform. In some sense, in my country, South Africa, we just need a legal reform to get back to what we had and what we lost because of American legal scholars perverting our legal tradition with their disgusting and decrepit and defunct legal opinions from an inferior legal tradition. And I go into that in the 3-hour lecture on even on sexuality, but also in my other recordings. And the other thing is that we need to reform psychology, because psychology, and by extension psychiatry, is a false authority. And obviously that, in some sense, I can be a little bit sympathetic to them, because in some sense you could say, well, no one came and solved all the problems, and they were doing the best that they could with what they had. But in some sense, the law should have been more protective of its citizens, to not be experimented on by people who had no idea what they were doing, and in the name of science they would, I mean, the history of psychology and psychiatry speaks for itself. And in some sense I think that we will learn that the pharmaceuticals that we have been experimenting with humans upon on humans with, in some sense I think that is even more egregious in some ways than lobotomies, assuming and hopefully that people can repair themselves from the kind of confusion and damage that these sorts of things have done to our systems, which are complicated and function in ways in which I mean, we are. There are things in psychological history which I don't think we fully properly understand. For example, when Freud made his way onto the scene, he did revolutionize psychology and he did revolutionize society, because he did influence the whole of industry, the whole of societal structures in many ways that people don't even fully understand. How obsessed people were with stimulants. Cocaine was in Coca-Cola. Stimulants was how the traditional society stabilized itself, in some sense. That was how I mean, in some sense I think this is how we kind of anesthetized the yearning of the spirit under stimulation of these narcotics, cocaine. And so we didn't understand even our own sexuality for a generation, because it was under the sea of these kinds of untoward influences that we weren't even connected with our own human condition. It was an augmented, mind manacled imposition and impingement. And in some sense, I think that it kind of did put things on pause a little bit. I don't think it was even necessarily World War II that created the pause. When did Jung die? But anyway, I would say what created the pause, I mean, I guess you could say that this was created by World War II. Was the convention of morality that was somewhat symbolized by the Nuremberg trials. And that project has now languished. that bit of progress has now tarnished, and it can be perfected, I believe, and it needs to be perfected. And I think that we will be an evolved species when we at one time have a courthouse that can say this is not merely a functionary in society, but this is actually a moral, a home of justice. That justice, the things that occur in here, and how the procedure and how the argument is judged, and how the level at which the court declines itself to make a judgment because the matter is not yet ripe, that there should be such a model of a moral adjudication that does not perhaps create judgments that are for all time, but that are justified and also open to revision, obviously in new units of time. When the material facts of the cases are somewhat novated. But anyway, I mean, we had a bit of that in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or at least we had a gesture towards that. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much into this, but I go into it more in the 3-hour recording. So let me just stop this recording, perhaps. So but I mean, I'm not resting my cap on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm resting it on a law of general application which is complete and essentially, although it's expressed better in the South African Constitution, equal protection under the law, which actually allows there to be a rule of law and not a rule of man, and a constitution that is so finely tuned between the limitations clause and the practice of equality and then the actual rights in the constitution, which are somewhat mediated by the practice of equality and further mediated by the limitations clause, that creates a way in which individuals can actually censure the state, that the judge can actually not just argue that the state did not have a legitimate government purpose, but that the legitimate government purpose is not just being irrational, but that its methodology of policy is inept, is substandard, is suboptimal, and the infringement of the rights that the policy creates is not justifiable, not because it's not rational enough, not because it's not a legitimate government purpose. It can still be self-consistent, it can still be rational, but that it's just not good enough when you consider the alternatives. When you consider another way of doing the same policy, that there is no prerogative to be protected in the Constitution from the government. And in some sense, then it better make sure that whatever it's doing, it doesn't infringe on other people's rights, or there isn't a better way of doing it, because then the court should censure the government policy. There is no special prerogative. And this is how justice rules, instead of the rule of man. Is if you have such a sophisticated law of general application and equal protection under the law, that means that the government does not have a special legislative fiat to legislate morality over the individual. Anyway, South Africa got this right, but we betrayed our legal tradition because of identity politics, because it was politically convenient to rather have institutionalized corruption. But anyway, I'm not going to, I have to put this in the other recording as well. Anyway.